And now I'm happy to be joined by a Middle East expert who knows the region almost better than anyone else that I know. Well, actually better than anyone else I know. To discuss America's shifting policy and diplomacy in this region, I couldn't be joined by anyone more knowledgeable. Please welcome John Alterman, Senior Vice President and Middle East Program Director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. John, we've been talking about the world for, 20, 25 years, inflection points, big changes. And so let me ask you, what is on the top of your list of things that we're not paying attention to that we have to?
To me, the biggest thing going on is everybody knows that in the future, the U.S. will have less of a footprint in the Middle East. In the future, China is likely to have more of a footprint in the Middle East. But what that transition will look like, what the relationships the U.S. will have with governments, what the U.S.-China relationship will look like, as there is a changing of both kinds of roles, what the Middle East might look like with less international interest for the first time in half a millennium. What that is going to look like, I think people are not really focusing on. I think people think that's over the horizon. The COVID-19 crash in the economy, the drop in oil prices made people say, oh, it's sooner than we think. But we haven't really figured out what is the world going to think about the Middle East in 2050. I mean, what is that transition going to look like? And what investments should we be making now to get ready for that reality?
That's a very, very interesting comment, because so much, one of the things I want to convey to our readers, at least it's my own impression, is that so many of our views, our biases, the baggage we bring to this subject is one of inertia. You talk about the Middle East because we've always talked about the Middle East. You think Israel-Palestine is going to be on the top because it's always been there, or Iran or Saudi Arabia. But there are different factors. America is a major energy exporter today. The whole drivers are coming in. So I guess, can you go a little bit further and tell us what decoupling would look like?
Well, Joe Biden released a plan yesterday saying the U.S. is basically going to be off hydrocarbons in 30 years' time. If the U.S. is really off hydrocarbons, then I assume a lot of the world is off hydrocarbons. And if a lot of the world is off hydrocarbons, the world's attention from all directions won't be focused in the Middle East. Some countries will have a focus in the Middle East because the Middle East is going to be where the last barrel of oil is pumped. It's the cheapest place to pump oil out of the ground in the world. It costs about $10 a barrel right now to pump oil out of the ground in the Middle East. But for a lot of the world, they say we're beyond that. We're doing renewables, we're doing nuclear, whatever people are doing, they're not going to be focused on the Middle East. The Middle East as a set of economies is all connected around the hydrocarbon business. Either you're exporting oil and gas, or you're exporting labor to work in countries that export oil and gas. So everybody's economy is linked. And if that gets decoupled from the global economy after 100 years, then the global economy and global security is going to have a different set of interests in the Middle East. The economies in the region are going to have to adapt. The populations are going to have to adapt. And that's not even talking about the roles of automation in economies. What happens to people who aren't very high-skilled workers and aren't very low-skilled workers, that sort of murky middle? That's where a lot of the jobs are being created in the Middle East. Will the jobs be there in 20 or 30 years? And what does that reality look like?
So who's going to take advantage of those conditions? We've been talking a lot today in today's program about China, about Russia, about other big classic strategic stakeholders. But China clearly is vastly different today than 30 years ago. Russia is still kind of, doesn't have all of its Soviet satellites, but you could argue, well, not much different there. But China has a lot more capacity, a lot more global networks, the Belt and Road Initiative, it has its acolytes. Is China cooking up stuff in the Middle East, filling in the holes? I think Russia may be as well. Are they filling the holes that we may be departing?
So I think China has a whole different operating system. They have a whole different concept. I grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York, and Poughkeepsie was the hometown of IBM, and IBM dominated the computer business. But what happened in the 1990s and the 2000s is the computer business moved. It moved away from hardware, it moved away from mainframes, it moved towards services and software and all kinds of things. And owning the sort of big mainframe business became less and less a part of IBM's overall business and less and less valuable. And other countries like Apple and Google and Facebook came up. I think China wants to be a country like that with a whole different operating system. China has no allies in the world. China has no allies. They don't believe in making allies. They don't believe in building alliances. They believe in individual states relate to each other. China's a big, powerful state. People pay subservience to China, and that works well for China. And they'd love the world to work that way. They'd love the world to have a bunch of authoritarian governments that are happy to deal with China as an authoritarian government. The United States keeps talking about democratization. We're going to transform societies. China's argument to governments is we will give you economic transformation without requiring political or social transformation, and that's attractive. And their way of relating to governments is a much lighter touch than this whole international ecosystem that the US has built. China doesn't inspire populations. I think the US in some ways has turned away from the business of inspiring populations. The US has recently turned away from alliances. That plays right into the Chinese role of thuggish governments are fine, we'll make our deal with them and we'll move on, and we will be the stronger power. That's the world China wants to live in. I'm not sure it's the world a lot of Americans want to live in, but it might be the world we're moving toward unless we think about what we actually want.
Wow, I'm going to take that clip of what you just said there because it was so powerful and disturbing, nightmarish in many ways. But I mean, I think you're right. I mean, it raises interesting. You wrote a piece for The Hill. I love this piece for The Hill. And I don't remember the title, but it was something along the lines of the politics of humiliation and the COVID-19 crisis and the Arab Spring and Bouazizi in Tunisia, and that there are these moments that humiliation drives behavior oftentimes more than earnestness, if you will, to try to get things. And what you just said with America walking away from alliances and being there, it's very, very important that people understand that part of being a superpower, part of getting the world to do what you want, is having mystique, being a leader, doing things that inspire others. But you just said that's off the table, I think. Is America about, particularly in this COVID crisis, going to be the humiliated nation?
Look, we've taken a clear hit because people have looked to us for professionalism and expertise and having our act together. One of the remarkable things about the US government is that it coordinates so well despite being so large and multifaceted. You could argue that the government is incompetent, and in sort of an absolute sense, you always wish the government were more competent. But if you think about the number of incredibly complex things the US government does, it's better than any government in the world, and the US government has clearly failed. But what I meant by the politics of humiliation is there are going to be millions and millions and millions of people around the world who had achieved middle class status, who thought they were all rising up,
right,
and have it all taken away from them. And the passion that excites, the insistence we won't take it and we won't go down without a fight is not the sort of we're going to have governance and technocrats, we're going to make it work. It's we're going to pull it all down. And if that spreads in the world, and I think in some places it will, especially in places where governments can't really support people through the COVID-19 mess, however long it lasts, I think that's going to create a different kind of world. And then the question is, do you want the answer to be, we're going to pull societies together and the US model is going to work, or the only way to deal with angry people is to crush them, which is in many ways what we've seen authoritarian governments doing around the world for quite some time.
Sounds a little bit like Nouriel Roubini's Main Street Manifesto about people being left, or a global version of the Arab Spring in some way. Let me just ask you finally, if you were to draw up an action plan for the U.S. in dealing with the rise of China, both dealing with it but trying not to fall into the trap, the zero-sum trap of a kinetic collision or something. What would be the elements of that, John?
Well, the first thing is, I think that, the U.S. military is spending a huge amount of time, energy, money, personnel thinking about what a kinetic war with China looks like. I think it is much more likely when we have a war with China, we're not going to be sure exactly when it starts and when it exactly ends. And I think that's true for the Chinese as well. This is not going to be a conventional war. We are each other's largest trading partners. It's a strange relationship. But I think we are dealing with a world in which people don't want to fight us on our terms. People would be crazy to go up against the US military, so they won't. So they find sort of gray zones, ways to tweak us. The Iranians have been doing this, others have been doing it. I think we have to figure out a way, A, to bring governments together much more than we've done. It's really reinventing the whole post-war system and making it fit for purpose in the 21st century. And we have to have better ways to engage with non-governmental actors, non-governmental forces, whether it be multinational corporations or political movements and those kinds of things. We're not used to doing that. We don't want to reach around partners to deal with their own citizens, but governments have to find a way to interface more effectively with the public. I think the biggest risk to governments around the world is we're going to be in such a crowded and noisy information space that governments won't be able to get anybody to do anything. Nobody will have credibility. Nobody will be able to lead or move the population, and we'll all descend into people's little angers without being able to pull off the collective action, which has been bringing us forward for centuries.
And it's so great to talk to you and mind-stretching. And I'm just reminded right now, so I'm about to talk to Robert Lightfoot from Lockheed Martin, the former NASA administrator, about space and missiles and all this. But the UAE has put an astronaut into space. They're about to send a probe off to Mars. And when you also look at what you just said that describes some in the middle class that have had so much taken care of, there are these contradictions out there that are just simmering, right? So you've got great stories. You also have troubling stories. And I'm grateful for you sharing them with us.
Thanks, Steve. Always great to see you.
Thanks so much, John. Great to see you.